The history of MMA is filled with larger-than-life characters, with larger-than-life personalities, and sometimes larger-than-allowed muscles. It turns out huge, angry people hitting each other in the face sometimes do so under the influence of performance-enhancing drugs. Who knew? Everyone from the winner of the first ever UFC event, the skinny pajama-wearing Royce Gracie, to the living Matrix himself, Anderson Silva, have tested positive for more than just saying their prayers and eating their vitamins. These are the top 10 times top MMA fighters gave top drug test results. MMA fighters are always following the latest fad, whether that's CrossFit, hyperbaric chambers, or underwater training. Some fighters take it even further, eating kangaroo meat or horse meat, or clenbuterol-tainted cow meat, or any meat that seems to contain steroids, really. Funny that. Number 10 on our list is Frank Mir, the former UFC heavyweight champion who a decade into his storied career started taking legal steroids with the permission of the UFC and the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Mir is one of the most high-profile users of the controversial testosterone replacement therapy, which involves injecting or otherwise taking exogenous testosterone, as in the anabolic, androgenic sex steroid, testosterone. In 2014, TRT was banned, and Mir's legal route for taking steroids evaporated. 2 years later, in a shocking turn of events no one could have predicted, Mir tested positive for the anabolic steroid turinabol. His explanation? He ate a kangaroo which took turinabol. Must have been this guy. Mir was suspended for 2 years by the United States Anti-Doping Agency, who were apparently unable to find evidence of an underground club of steroid-abusing kangaroos. At number 9, we have Nick Diaz. Well, we could have Diaz at number 9, 8, 7, and 6, since he's failed 3 drug tests, all for marijuana, and all just copped a 1-year USADA suspension for not bothering to let USADA know where he actually was in order to be tested 3 times in a year. Oops. For this entry, we're discussing Diaz's infamous run-in with the Nevada State Athletic Commission in 2015, when Diaz allegedly tested over the allowable limit for cannabis metabolites. Diaz actually gave 3 samples that day, the first and third being sent to a World Anti-Doping Agency accredited lab, and the second being sent to Quest Labs, which is very much not a WADA accredited lab. According to the test at the accredited lab, Diaz was under the allowed threshold. According to the test at Quest, he was double the allowed threshold. Diaz, on the advice of his lawyer, availed himself on his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination throughout the hearing, which just made NSAC member Pat Lundvall mad. Like really, really mad. Lundvall brought up the possibility of banning Diaz for life for smoking some weed, before eventually seeing reason and banning him for just 5 years. Wait, what? That suspension didn't last long, as someone apparently pointed out to Lundvall that it's kind of illegal to punish someone for pleading the fifth. And the NSAC quietly revised the suspension down to 18 months, which allowed us to see Diaz compete several more... Oh, never mind. He hasn't fought since. Coming in at number 8 is Alistair Overeem, aka the Demolition Man, aka the Reem, aka Ubereem, aka Horse-a-Remeat. Overeem underwent one of the most incredible physical transformations in MMA history, maybe in the history of the world. Remember the scene where Steve Rogers takes some super serum and becomes Captain America? Overeem's transformation made that look quaint. Overeem went from a 205 pounds beanpole to a 265 pounds of pure muscle while competing for Japanese promotion Pride FC. Pride had a drug testing policy, and the policy was, take all the steroids please, which led to some truly astounding physiques. Overeem never failed a steroid test while competing for Pride FC, because it's hard to fail a test you never took. Overeem was meant to be tested by the Nevada Athletic Commission ahead of his UFC 141 bout with Borck Lesnar, but gave a sample that didn't meet commission standards. Unfortunately, Overeem couldn't just provide another sample, since he urgently had to leave the country to go back to Holland to see Mama Reem. Nevada unsurprisingly still wanted their sample, so Overeem went to his personal physician and had his physician test him. Overeem's doctor assured the Nevada Athletic Commission that he wasn't on steroids. That didn't convince them, and that made him undergo several additional tests before letting him compete. Less than 6 months later, Overeem tested with an elevated testosterone to epitestosterone ratio. The average ratio is 1:1. Under 1% of people have a ratio of 6:1. Overeem's ratio was 14:1. This was apparently caused by his doctor putting testosterone in his anti-inflammatory cream. Don't you just hate it when your doctor mixes anabolic steroids into your ibuprofen? Overeem got a 9-month suspension for his mishap because PED punishments were ridiculous 6 years ago. Number 7 on the list is Anderson the Spider Silva. Silva is rightfully considered one of the greatest martial artists of all time. Not only did he have one of the most dominant runs in the history of mixed martial arts, he made it look like he was in an action movie the whole time. He would stand with his hands by his sides, daring opponents to hit him. If an opponent wouldn't engage, he would hide behind the referee and play peekaboo. He would back himself against the cage and beg his opponents to try and punch him. Then, when they did, he would knock them out clean for their audacity. Alas, time makes a fool of all men, and Anderson Silva was no exception. A younger, bigger, stronger fighter named Chris Weidman finally beat him, and in the rematch not only defeated Silva, but snapped his leg in half in one of the hardest to watch moments in MMA history. A little over a year later, coming off a major injury and the first back-to-back losses of his 18-year career, Silva failed multiple drug tests around his UFC 183 bout against Nick Diaz. Silva failed an out-of-competition test on January 9, 2015. For the anabolic steroid drostanolone and steroid metabolite androstane, passed a test on January 19th, then failed his fight night test on January 31st. For both drostanolone and androstane, again, as well as his anti-anxiety and sleep aid pills, oxazepam and temazepam, which aren't on the WADA prohibited list, but which Nevada doesn't allow without therapeutic use exemption. Silva admitted to deliberately taking oxazepam and temazepam, but claimed the positive steroid tests were due to a sexual stimulant pill given to him by a former training partner who procured it in Thailand. Silva's quest for better sex got him a 1-year suspension, and his victory was overturned to a no contest. 2 years later, in late 2017, Silva would fail another drug test, this time for anabolic steroid methyltestosterone and an unnamed diuretic. His case is still being investigated by the UFC's anti-doping partner, USADA. And rumors that Silva is blaming this failed test on his cousin's husband's friend who gave him a Cambodian love potion couldn't be confirmed. At number 6 is Borck Lesnar. A man who looks less like a real person and more like a comic book artist got a bit carried away. Lesnar was able to skip several weeks of mandatory USADA testing with a UFC granted exemption, but he still managed to fail a pre-fight drug test ahead of UFC 200. Due to a completely innocent mistake by USADA, Lesnar's test results were not expedited, and as a result, no one found out he was on performance-enhancing drugs until after he beat the crap out of MMA legend Mark Hunt, who subsequently sued the UFC, Lesnar, and basically everyone who was anywhere near the cage that night over the situation. Lesnar's positive test wasn't for an anabolic steroid, but it was for an anti-estrogenic drug called clomiphene, usually given to women with infertility. It's unlikely Lesnar was having ovulation issues, but thanks to how the drug works on a pituitary gland, it can double natural testosterone production in a healthy man. A huge advantage on its own, and also something used to kickstart natural testosterone production after a cycle of anabolic steroids. Lesnar's team blamed eye medication and foot cream for his positive test. Since neither of those medications typically contain female fertility medication, that excuse didn't fly. Lesnar received the maximum 1-year suspension from USADA, and an identical suspension from the Nevada Athletic Commission. Lesnar got bored of being suspended after a few months and just retired, meaning that he still had to serve out the remaining 6 months of his suspension if he wants to fight in the UFC octagon again. The number 5 slot belongs to the man who kicked off the entire MMA revolution, Royce Gracie. The winner of UFC 1 and the man who demonstrated the effectiveness of submission grappling to the attention of millions, would fail a drug test late in his illustrious MMA career. Gracie tested positive for a banned anabolic steroid, nandrolone, following his 2007 rematch against the reanimated corpse of longtime rival Kazushi Sakuraba. Gracie, arguably in better shape in his early 40s than he was in his 20s, lost the fight, then lost his MMA license following the positive test results. Gracie denied deliberately using performance-enhancing drugs, and was unable to explain his elevated test results. It was probably because of his unfair time limits, or the wrong rule set, or it was the referee's fault. or he didn't fail at all, and he is actually 500-0 in drug tests. At number 4 is Vitor, the Phenom Belfort, also known as the Old Lion and less officially as TRT Rex. Oh man, this is an interesting one. Belfort has technically failed 3 drug tests in his career, but has only been punished for 1. Back in 2006, while fighting in Pride in Nevada, Belfort tested positive for the anabolic steroid 4-hydroxytestosterone. He was suspended for 9 months and fined for this. So far, so normal. Here's where it gets interesting. After this, during his second UFC stint, Vitor Belfort was one of the fighters taking testosterone replacement therapy, TRT, while receiving a therapeutic use exemption, TUE, to allow him to do so. TRT is intended to treat people who have low levels of total testosterone, usually defined as under around 300 nanograms per deciliter in the blood. This is accomplished via patches, injections, implants, or creams. Per the head of the Nevada State Athletic Commission, at the time, Keith Kaiser, fighters on TRT should only be allowed to increase their total testosterone levels to that of the average man, because 600 and 700 nanograms per deciliter in the blood. Belfort was scheduled to fight Jon Jones at UFC 152, and the UFC apparently gave him permission to be on testosterone replacement therapy, but Belfort's levels came back high. His total testosterone came back at 1,038 nanograms per deciliter, just within the normal limits, but above what someone on TRT would be allowed to have in Nevada. His free testosterone came back at 41.7 picograms per milliliter. That's almost double the normal range of 8.7 to 25.1. What did the UFC do with the information that their headliner had elevated levels of total testosterone? Well, they accidentally emailed that information to a bunch of other people, including fighters and managers, by accident. Seriously. They followed that up with a series of increasingly desperate messages asking the recipients to delete the email, including one from the UFC's lawyer threatening legal action on anyone who shared this information. Please note that if you have or intend to disclose or disseminate this information to anyone, Zuffa will have no choice but to seek all available judicial remedies against you in both your professional and personal capacities. The UFC, having accidentally outed Belfort's elevated levels, pulled him from the fight and, just kidding, they totally let him fight. Didn't tell the Ontario Commission about the test, not that Ontario wanted to know, and didn't tell his opponent, Jon Jones, either, as you do. This isn't the end of the story though. Belfort stayed on testosterone replacement therapy and was tested by the Nevada Athletic Commission in early 2014. Belfort tested with elevated levels of testosterone, 1,472 nanograms per deciliter, well above the normal range of 348 to 1,197 nanograms per deciliter, and elevated free testosterone over 50 picograms per milliliter, where the normal range is 8.7 to 25.1 picograms per milliliter. 3 weeks later, the Nevada State Athletic Commission voted to ban testosterone replacement therapy outright. Have you ever failed a drug test so hard that you got a medical treatment outright banned? Vitor Belfort probably did. Belfort claimed he went on TRT following his loss to Anderson Silva. Out of his next 6 fights, he lost just 1, to Jon Jones. After TRT was banned, Belfort fought 7 more times. He won just 2 of those fights, both against men who had also previously taken TRT, Dan Henderson and Nate Marquardt. This officially makes Belfort the pound-for-pound TRT champion of the world. At number 3 is the first and only woman to make it to this list, Cris Cyborg. Cyborg is known as an ultra-physical and aggressive fighter with one of the most shredded physiques in the sport. Her history with PED use goes back to late 2011, when she beat Hikaru Yamanaka in just 16 seconds, before immediately failing for a banned anabolic steroid, stanozolol. Oops! Cyborg claims someone in her camp gave her the substance to help her make weight for her fight, and that she had no idea it was a banned steroid until she took it. The California State Athletic Commission gave her a 1-year suspension, overturned the result of her contest, and fined her $2,500. In 2016, Cyborg tested positive for banned diuretic and masking agent spironolactone during a routine out-of-competition drug test administered by USADA. Cyborg failed to disclose that she was taking the medication at the time of her test, Despite the doping control form, she filled out stating she should list all supplements and medications. Olympic athletes failing to disclose this are ineligible for a TUE, but the UFC's deal with USADA contains a loophole around that particular requirement. As a result, Cyborg was allowed to apply for a therapeutic use exemption for her positive test, while Olympic and other athletes tested by USADA wouldn't be able to do. Based on the information provided by her physician, USADA's TUE committee decided to approve her for spironolactone, and she escaped punishment for her failed test. At number 2 is Chael P. Sonnen, another infamous user of TRT. In Sonnen's case, he tested with an elevated testosterone to epitestosterone ratio following his fight with Anderson Silva in California in 2010. Sonnen's testosterone to epitestosterone came back at 17-1, where an average ratio is around 1-1. During his hearing, Sonnen claimed to have previously received a TUE for TRT in California, which apparently wasn't the case. He claimed to have received one in Nevada, which also wasn't the case, and claimed to have spoken directly to NSAC head Keith Kaiser about his TRT, which definitely wasn't the case. He was initially suspended for 1 year, which was reduced to 6 months following an appeal, and then increased to an indefinite suspension when his false claims at this appeal were looked into. Whoops. Sonnen wasn't done there though. In 2014, it was announced that he had failed an out-of-competition test administered by the Nevada State Athletic Commission on May 24th for 2 banned substances, clomiphene and anastrozole. A subsequent sample gathered on June 5th was also positive. That's not surprising, since most drugs are detectable for weeks or months. Never mind. He actually tested positive for more drugs this time. That's right, in the sample taken just 2 weeks after his first sample, Sonnen actually managed to test positive for even more drugs. This time his sample showed anastrozole, human chorionic gonadotropin, recombinant human erythropoietin, EPO, and human growth hormone, HGH. Go big or go home, right? Well, in Sonnen's case, it was go big and go home, as he retired from MMA on the back of the failed tests. Or at least, retired until his suspension was up, at which point he signed with Bellator. Finally, we get to our number 1 spot, and fittingly, it's occupied by perhaps the greatest fighter in the history of the sport, Jon Jones. Jones is interesting in that he technically has 3 failed tests, but one of them doesn't and shouldn't actually count. We should explain. In anti-doping, there are 2 separate lists of banned substances. Some substances are banned at all times. This is called an out-of-competition prohibited list. You can't take these ever. The other list is called an in-competition prohibited list. You can take these drugs as much as you want as long as they're not detectable in your system come competition time. Pretty much all recreational drugs are only banned in competition, including cocaine. Jon Jones apparently likes, or at least liked, him some Peruvian marching powder, but was always careful to be finished dancing with the Snow White before his fights. Normally, that would be that, and there would be no problem. Unfortunately, athletic commissions are really bad at handling drug testing. The Nevada State Athletic Commission, as a result of an administrative oversight, tested Jones for recreational drugs during the out-of-competition period in December 2014. Jones' results came back for the yayo, and now the UFC and the NSAC had a headache. See, Jones should never have been tested for cocaine out of competition in the first place, but now both the NSAC and the UFC knew he was taking an illegal drug. The NSAC eventually ruled they couldn't punish Jones because, he didn't actually break their rules. The UFC fined Jones $25,000 for violating their code of conduct, which is basically a clause in the UFC contract saying, "Don't do stupid idiots." That situation wasn't really Jones's fault. Outside of him taking the coke in the first place, his next run-in with anti-doping authorities was though. In July 2016, just days before he was due to headline UFC 200, Jones was informed he had tested positive for 2 estrogen blockers in a sample he had recently provided to the United States Anti-Doping Agency. Estrogen blockers can act as performance enhancers on their own by increasing the natural production of testosterone via their action on the pituitary gland, even doubling it. But they're also commonly used as post-cycle therapy to kickstart the body after a cycle of anabolic steroids shut it down. Either way, Testing positive for these drugs isn't a good thing. Jones' explanation for how he ended up with drugs in his system also didn't help. Jones claimed that a teammate he knew as a casual acquaintance offered him some magic pills to make him perform better in the bedroom. Jones, envisioning his beanstalk becoming giant, shrugged and took them, which is totally a normal thing people totally do. He claims those pills are the reason he tested positive. USADA tested the pills and found that yes, they did in fact contain clomiphene and letrozole. They also contained another banned substance that didn't show up on Jones' tests. But the pills were made with all of the quality control you would expect a back alley big pills to be made with. So that wasn't too shocking. Jones' teammate admitted to ordering the pills. He also had ordered performance-enhancing drugs on purpose at the same time though. Oops. Nonetheless, the arbitrators found that the evidence suggested Jones wasn't deliberately trying to cheat. They also found that taking random pills from people you barely know is really f***ing stupid, and suspended him for a year. The full sentence these substances carried, for being a complete dumbass basically. So far we've established that Jon Jones is a man who doesn't make good decisions. We've done that without even mentioning his habit of crashing cars into things like telephone poles and other cars containing pregnant ladies. Surely though, a millionaire like him will be smart enough to not make the same mistakes over and over again, right? Wrong. In August 2017, just months after returning from his previous suspension, Jon Jones once again tested positive for banned substances. This time, it was an anabolic steroid, turinabol. The case is still dragging on, and USADA haven't handed down a punishment yet, but Jones is facing up to a 4-year suspension. Jones had to face the California State Athletic Commission over his failed test, and it did not go well. He had an expert witness, Dr. Scott, say that he thought Jones didn't take turinabol deliberately. Here's an excerpt of a report about Dr. Scott's testimony at the time. Dr. Scott admitted that he based at least some of his knowledge of how much turinabol a person would use on things he read on a bodybuilding website provided by Jones' attorney, Howard Jacobs. Dr. Scott assumed that turinabol would show up in a sample for longer than it actually did if Jones had been using it to enhance performance. Dr. Scott was asked how much turinabol someone would take if they were enhancing performance. Dr. Scott said that it would normally be expressed as milligrams per kilograms, but he did not know Jon Jones' weight, didn't look up his weight, and then he gleaned the information about how it was used from people who used it unlawfully. Dr. Scott stated he researched turinabol for 4 hours as a part of this case and was paid $395 an hour for his work. Dr. Scott was ultimately forced to admit that there was a great deal of uncertainty around his conclusions, that there was no way to tell how much turinabol Jones took from the results of the tests or other information that he had, and that his conclusion relied on several unsupported assumptions. With friends like that, who needs enemies? Unsurprisingly, the CSAC threw the book at Jones, giving him an indefinite suspension and a $205,000 fine. Jones' team are still negotiating with USADA over the penalty from that organization, and the option of going to arbitration again is on the table. But it's starting to look like Jones is going to be out for a few years, at the very least. It's somewhat fitting that the most dominant champion in the sport's history flames out in the most spectacular way possible.